when you can't fix their pain. Letting go, finding rest. Right now, a rapid vibrating twitching and tightening is pulsing steadily within the small muscles of both your palms and along the sensitive thin webbing between your thumbs. It is the distinct somatic imprint of geographic helplessness, the exhausting, modern ache of lying awake at midnight, while someone you love faces a crisis or a deep struggle, thousands of miles away across an unbridgeable distance. Your hands are clenched into a tight, phantom grip in the dark, unconsciously trying to wrap your fingers around an imaginary steering line to guide them, fix their pain, and pull them to safety from afar. Your mind is operating at a high, desperate velocity, checking for updates, analyzing distant outcomes, and replaying their difficulties over and over, as if the sheer force of your late-night worry could somehow act as a protective tether across the chasm. You are carrying the heavy, solitary torment of a watchman who believes that if they drop their alertness for even a single hour, the person they love will slide completely under the waves. The quiet shelter of your room is adapting to the damp autumn evening, providing a cool, unmonitored space where the desperate demand to control what is out of reach can finally drop its momentum. Outside, the slow, rhythmic lap of brackish water moves through the thick lakeside reed beds, while a heavy, silent fog settles into the low wetlands, wrapping the weathered cedar posts of the ferry pavilion in a damp insulation that requires no manual steering. Inside, the rustic, deep aroma of wet lake reeds rises from the shoreline paths, blending naturally with the cold, oily scent of treated canvas sailcloth drying near the hearth. The dim, copper-toned glow of a single grease lamp burning in a shallow stone trough casts long, motionless shadows across the unpolished pine walls, while the thick, tightly woven hemp mat beneath your mattress provides a solid, unyielding plane that absorbs the residual tension of your upper limbs. The cool, crisp texture of the raw linen sheets beneath your wrists begins to draw the electric heat away from your palms, gently inviting your fingers to uncurl. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the heavy framework of your arms sink completely into the bedding, allowing the complex equations of your distant worry to remain suspended in the outer fog. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are tracking in this rapid, vibrating twitching within the sensitive webbing between your thumbs is not a personal failure, nor is it proof that your love is insufficient because you cannot physically reach across the geography to fix the crisis tonight. The profound exhaustion you carry is a wise, somatic message, a clear physical signal that your system has simply grown weary of treating your late-night worry as an active lifeline that must be maintained through endless vigilance. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately locate absolute certainty before your body is permitted to rest. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to guarantee the safety of the distant shore before your wrists are allowed to let go of their brace. Right now, nothing is required of you now, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a liberating, beautiful paradox within the heart of Buddhist insight that addresses this specific panic of helpless distance through a surprising truth. We live under the persistent illusion that our protection is achieved by carving out an isolated, permanent path of control, a solitary steering line, where our personal effort can dictate every wave or correct every storm in our life and the lives of those we hold dear. We treat our love as a fragile boat that we must support entirely through our own muscular grip, fearing that if we show a single moment of ease, the entire vessel will capsize in the gale. But the ancient wisdom of the Zen tradition reveals that true stability is found not by perfecting a rigid steering mechanism, but by recognizing that you and the person you love have never been separate from the massive, supportive depth beneath you. This is the mystery of the loose rudder pin. A single iron dowel slipping faintly within its retaining bracket does not mean the immense calm water holding the hull is about to evaporate. The suffering does not come from the distance between the shores, it grows from the habit of treating your tight grip on the oar as if it were the only thing keeping the world from sinking. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, visceral dropping in your chest when an unexpected notification or an ambiguous silence makes you feel as though a loved one is standing on a loose platform far away. The intellect instantly turns inward, converting this natural empathy into a harsh moral verdict, whispering that because you are sitting in a safe room while they suffer, you are a fundamental failure who has abandoned their post. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the simple fatigue of a loving heart. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral reality of navigating a complex life across distance, the natural limitation of a human body that cannot inhabit two places at once. The second pain, however, is the one you strike against your own palms, declaring that your geographical helplessness is a defect that must be corrected through even harder mental scrutiny tomorrow. But the lake moss does not apologize to the cedar for its dampness, and the marsh reeds do not feel remorse for bending in the current. The vibration you hold is merely a temporary configuration of form, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is cradling your room tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a reedy lakeside ferry pavilion during a cold, rainy autumn twilight, where a young boatman sat staring at a hand-hammered iron dowel with a blunt head, carrying the exact same vibrating energy that is binding your hands right now. But before we step onto those damp pine planks, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your upper body. Let the fine muscles around your forearms, your wrists, and your fingers drop their defensive bracing. Let your palms feel heavy and thick, and let the webbing between your thumbs give up its tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that the distant shore will feel perfectly stable before the morning light arrives. The world will manage its own complex crossings without your constant supervision for the next few hours, and every unpinned bracket, every unfinished journey, and every rattling joint can remain completely stranded in the dark. We spend so much of our life treating our connection to others as a solitary performance that must be continuously fortified against uncertainty, believing that if we let our protection drop for even a single hour, those we love will be completely ruined by failure. We evaluate our love by the tightness of our grip, and then we wonder why our lower arms feel like cold iron when the daylight fades. But the vast shoreline watchpost does not feel a shred of guilt for remaining exposed, rugged, and unfinished beneath the autumn stars. And the damp fog does not apologize to the willow trees for growing in the branches. The nervousness you hold does not come from the simple fact that you care deeply. It grows from the current resistance that refuses to let the oar rattle, without demanding that your core immediately justify its presence through more overthinking. Let another breath arrive naturally, without you needing to measure its velocity or prove its alignment. Let it move directly into the tight channels of your upper neck, down through the back of your shoulders, and deep into the very center of your palms. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the metrics, expectations, and protective enclosures of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool lakeside air is moving through the wet wood outside, requiring no final justifications and demanding no perfect confidence before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the linen beneath your hands as we prepare to step onto the damp timber walkway, where the keeper of the ferry is waiting to show us how to let the water hold us. Deep within the wide, mud-ringed basin where the lake flat stretched its dark expanse toward a distant, hidden shore, the autumn twilight hung heavy with the brackish scent of wet reeds and rotting willow leaves. In this silent world of gray water, beneath the low-slung thatch of a lakeside ferry pavilion, a young boatman named Takashi worked with a restless, continuous twitching that stayed concentrated entirely within the sensitive webbing between his thumbs. His mind was locked in a bitter, internal tug-of-war. Having been tasked with managing the late evening crossing, while a fierce seasonal gale brewed across the open water, he could not stop his thoughts from leaping across the 3 leagues of dark lake to the northern village, where his elderly mother lay ill. He stood by the mooring posts, his fingers curled tightly into the rough, damp fibers of a securing rope, utterly paralyzed by his physical distance from her struggle, replaying every failure of his care, and believing that if he relaxed his hands for even a single minute, the unguided current would destroy everything he loved. The boat was entirely stationary, tied securely to the pine pilings, Yet Takashi's forearms retained the rigid, defensive leverage of a man fighting a massive wave in the center of the lake. He treated his geographic separation not as a natural limitation of his human frame, but as a dangerous omission that he had to correct through an unrelenting, physical display of readiness. He filled his awareness with complex calculations of maritime disaster, interpreting the rhythmic slapping of the wavelets against the cedar hull as an immediate signal that his vigilance was the only line keeping the distant family from ruin. The harder he tried to project his protective intent across the chasm through mental repetition, the more raw and thin the muscles of his palms became, leaving his thumbs locked in a tight, defensive pinch that refused to let his weight sink down into the floorboards. The senior keeper of the ferry crossing was old Tessin, a silent traveler, whose knuckles were thick and split from 40 winters of handling heavy pine oars, and whose slow, deliberate movements held the absolute neutral weight of the shoreline stones. Tessin did not offer formal rules on navigation or deliver standard lectures on mindfulness to the apprentices who swept the mud from the deck, choosing instead to spend his twilights inspecting the hull seams with his bare palms or drying the heavy canvas sails near the charcoal brazier. He had been quietly monitoring the progressive freezing of Takashi's posture, noting how the young man's shoulders jumped every time the marsh grass whistled in the wind, and how his breath remained trapped inside the very top of his throat, as if he were trying to pull the boat across the water by sheer muscular restriction. On an evening when the dark water began to turn black under the shadows of the low clouds, reducing the distant hills to a faint, unrecognizable line on the horizon, Tessin called the young boatman to the stern of the vessel. The workspace was intensely quiet, save for the low gurgle of the water beneath the rudder and the slow, heavy drip of moisture from the slatted roof. On the unpolished oak bench between them lay a hand-hammered iron dowel with a blunt head, the central rudder pin that had slipped completely out of its lower retaining loop during the afternoon run, leaving the long steering oar to slap uselessly against the cedar hull with a hollow, clicking friction. Takashi stood near the bench, the small muscles of his palms vibrating with an intense, familiar panic, his intellect instantly spinning a rapid explanation to justify why the metal had slid, preparing an intricate argument to prove he could still force the boat across the rough channel by gripping the bare wood of the tiller with his raw hands. The old ferryman did not pick up a hammer to drive the metal back into place tonight, and he did not voice a single reprimand regarding the loose rudder. Instead, Tessin reached out his calloused hand, rolled the cold iron pin across the grain of the bench until it rested directly against the young man's trembling thumb, and asked Takashi to look out over the darkened lake to consider if the vast, supportive water holding the hull was truly dependent on the absolute, unyielding tightness of his bare hands, or if the deep basin itself was already sustaining the weight of both shores long before the first ferry was ever built. Takashi looked down at the loose piece of iron, the cold, blunt metal absorbing the frantic heat of his palm, his breath catching deep in his chest with a sudden, profound wave of emotional recognition. The slipped pin had not caused the lake to widen, and his desperate muscular grip on the unguided tiller had done nothing to shorten the miles between himself and his mother's bedside. The distance was simply a neutral, unalterable reality of the landscape, and his late-night panic was merely a hollow friction, a wobbly iron dowel rattling within an empty bracket, completely unable to touch or protect the distant shore. He looked up at the old ferryman, the tight webbing between his thumbs slowly beginning to widen as the realization mirrored the true condition of his own helpless worry. He saw that his mind had been treating his internal anxiety like a manual steering line, believing that his frantic night calculations were a literal tether keeping his family safe, when in truth, his vigilance was only blinding him to the massive, quiet depth that was actively holding both sides of the water. The elder traveler took the iron pin back, sliding it into the pocket of his oiled canvas vest without any urgency to repair the steering oar before the morning light arrived. He told the apprentice that the deepest torment of the boatman is not the length of the lake, but the delusion that his solitary ego must hold the entire current in its hands to keep the world from sinking. Tesson pointed out that the vessel stayed afloat because it rested on the vast collective density of the water, not because an isolated watcher ruined his wrists against an unpinned rudder. The trembling Takashi held in his palms did not mean he was failing his family. It grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of separating himself from the very ground that was actively sustaining his life and the lives of those he held far away. Takashi sat down on the low storage chest in the stern, letting his bare elbows rest on his knees, his hands dropping with the palms facing upward as the cool, damp lake air moved through his fingers. For the first time in many seasons, the rapid buzzing vibration along the webbing of his thumbs began to lose its sharp momentum, allowing the heavy framework of his arms to give up their defensive brace against the dark. He did not instantly dissolve the real, painful sorrow of his mother's illness, and the geographic distance did not magically vanish from the map, but he stopped treating the rattling of the iron as a command to freeze his body, allowing the boat to remain quiet in the reeds. Slowly, the deep, unhurried stability of that misty lake flat moves into the immediate shelter of your own room tonight, letting the image of the resting cedar hull anchor your overstimulated mind. You have been lying awake replaying the details of a distant struggle, counting the miles between yourself and the people you wish you could protect, and letting the fear of helplessness convince you that you must maintain a perpetual grip in the dark. You have believed that if you do not stay raw and alert, the shore you love will fall into ruin. But the massive, interconnected floor of your true nature remains completely undisturbed by the small rattling of your thoughts. Let the iron pin rest on the wood, allowing your awareness to slide downward into the heavy, immovable reality of the ground beneath your bed. This reflection on the hand-hammered iron dowel and the misty lakeside pavilion is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding structures who watch the suffering of those we love with a blank, detached indifference. It is not an instruction to erase the deep, aching tenderness that surfaces when someone who holds a piece of our heart is navigating a painful trial across an unbridgeable geographical gulf. Instead, it is showing us something much quieter, a soft shift in our internal stance that allows us to hold our distant connections without converting our forearms and hands into a constant emergency winch. The persistent, rapid twitching that vibrates through the sensitive webbing between your thumbs tonight does not manifest simply because the miles are wide or because a situation far away is genuinely heavy. The deepest suffering takes root when the intellect insists on treating your Latin-night mental panic as an active steering line, under the tragic assumption that keeping your body in a state of raw tension will somehow protect a distant shore from the gale. When we look at this pattern of long-distance anxiety through the simple, unadorned language of Buddhist insight, we see that what we traditionally call attachment is actually that frantic internal clenching that declares, "Until I can receive a definitive message that everything is perfectly secure on the other side of the water, my system is forbidden to lay down its oars." It is the exhausting habit of using total hypervigilance as a false metric of devotion, desperately trying to preempt every potential disaster just to quiet the terrifying sensation of helplessness. We treat our love as a fragile boat that we must personally propel through sheer muscular restriction. And when the silence between updates stretches out, we experience the desperate emotional state of craving the endless Latinite mental loop that tries to bridge the geography through a fierce, exhausting application of worry. We mistake our changing, frantic thoughts for a literal lifeline, forgetting that a loose rudder pin rattling in the dark cannot alter the massive, quiet depth of the lake that is already sustaining both banks. An iron pin left sitting loosely on the unpolished oak bench cannot cause the distant village to capsize. No matter how many winters you spend replaying your helplessness in the dark, the day's events have already run their course. The ferry has been tied to its pilings. The wetlands have settled into their thick insulation of fog. When we lie awake burning our remaining internal energy to maintain these frantic, protective calculations, we are participating in a quiet psychological process that adds an entirely unnecessary second wound to the first. The first wound is merely the raw, neutral reality of a loving human life across distance, the natural limitation of a single body that cannot inhabit two places at once, navigating an ambiguous crisis or feeling the simple sorrow of an unalterable separation. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily paths. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own palms when our thoughts turn inward and declare that because we are sitting in a quiet room while they struggle, we are failing our post. Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the rapid, vibrating, twitching, humming along the webbing of your thumbs right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for a manual steering line with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of attention is not a complicated academic discipline that you must study before your wrists are permitted to soften. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the parched landscape of your distant worries without allowing that dryness to dictate the depth of your immediate breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid restriction behind your forearms, to label it gently as the old habit of treating your love as an isolated performance, and to recognize that the rattle belongs entirely to the loose pin, not to the wide interconnected floor that is holding you tonight. When you allow the dowel to rest on the wood without continuously testing it against your value as a protector, you stop feeding the analytical frost that keeps your fingers curled. You let the distance exist on the map while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, when translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for an overworked spirit. It acts as a gentle reminder that the monumental weight of your distant concern is not a solid, eternal block trapped inside your skin. That grand collection of rules and protective reactions was a temporary configuration of thoughts that belonged to a specific hour. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this bed is entirely separate from those analytical calculations, its palms capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the boundaries of an absolute standard. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive freeze, just to protect an intellectual platform that has already returned to the silence of the marsh. True letting go does not mean you stop caring about your family, or that you pretend your helplessness does not feel heavy. It means you stop using the tightness of your grip as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the thinned, exhausted channels of your past effort to control. Look at the loose iron with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the vessel to rest where it will, without demanding that your nervous system become perfectly calm before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your life must always hold an intact display of absolute protection for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own unfinished architecture and hold your vulnerable frame with a tenderness that requires no external validation. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the complex safety codes you tried to maintain during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the layout of your distant relationships before it agrees to warm your hands, and your lungs do not demand a perfect guarantee of safety from the northern village before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of conceptual performance, resting securely within a night that requires no completed insights before it offers you its rest. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the linen beneath your hands, as we prepare to step onto the dry shoreline watchpost, where the old nun is waiting to show us the nature of the weight that remains when the solitary ego is finally set aside. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently right along the broad, flat expanse of your open palms, arriving at the exact physical parameters where that rapid, vibrating twitching has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of your distant worries away, and there is no requirement to make your nervous system completely quiet by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the restriction, observing the stubborn, unyielding shudder behind your fingers and within the thin webbing between your thumbs, as if you were merely looking at a hand-hammered iron dowel with a blunt head, resting on an unpolished oak bench, without any urgency to hammer the metal or force the ferry boat to instantly cross the darkened water. As you rest here in the deep indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your forearms, your wrists, and the lowest chambers of your lungs. Let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your upper limbs drop their protective brace, allowing the wrists to widen slightly naturally, and let your fingers feel heavy, as if they were dissolving into the damp, thatch-lined storage chest beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment, and even just noticing that your hands still feel tight, guarded, or full of electric friction is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been applying its frantic vigilance against the vast uncertainty of an unmapped space. Right now, let the specific memory of that distant struggle float up into your awareness, perhaps. The exact moment where you feared a sudden downturn. The exhaustion of watching your defensive rules multiply without a guarantee. Or the general, heavy worry that your loved one will be permanently ruined if your hands relax their grip for even a single minute. Do not try to analyze the validity of the past caution, and do not try to fix the geography of the day that has gone. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your thumbs. You might say to yourself, very quietly, this is the habit of pulling the ghost tiller, or this is the old analytical frost trying to freeze the empty rudder. Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal laboratory and standing beside old Tesson on the damp pine deck, looking at the loose iron pin from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your remaining worries about safety are like that loose iron dowel, its natural capacity having become hardened and unyielding from hours of continuous dry hypervigilance. Look at its blunt head in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that rough surface today, fixing your sight entirely upon the tiny vibration, letting that dark restriction convince you that your true connection is an isolated boat that must be propelled through sheer muscular restriction. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to secure an absolute path, that persistent wish to bridge the geography through a fierce application of worry, and allowing it to rest quietly inside the hollow, dark vault of the container. You do not have to build a fortress across the lake flat with your exhaustion. And you do not have to decipher the infinite mystery. You are simply setting the implement down on the slate counter, while you step back into your choosing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your lower neck as you let the responsibility sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the loose, dry iron begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the autumn evening. Imagine the thick, sun-baked crust of oxidation beginning to soften naturally, its dark layers expanding, splitting, and flaking away from the underlying metal under the gentle pressure of the damp air, leaving the unlined stone curb of your awareness completely clear and open beneath the surface. The faint, comforting aroma of wet lake reeds rises from the lower framework, filling the room with a stable, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced execution of logic. The mountain does not collapse, and the floorboards remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The dust on the table does not diminish the capacity of the stone to remain steady. It is simply a layer of sand in the room, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured field that is holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the northern village, the expectations of the crossing, or the steering lines you wish you could fortify to prove your absolute value, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its protective spaces. The slow hiss of the grease lamp outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast, open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the loose rudder pin. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its frost through an act of sheer will, and you do not have to guarantee that the distant bank will feel safe before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable roles of the ferryman rest on the table, while the unmoving dark continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner basin wide, unanchored, and deeply at peace. Further along the jagged shoreline, where the marshy wetlands narrowed into a vast, treacherous field of black peat mud, a solitary timber watchpost sat bolted to a low granite outcrop. Inside this low-ceilinged structure, the air stayed thick with the briny, cold scent of brackish water, rotting peat moss, and the pungent aroma of pine resin melting inside an iron signal basket. Here lived Hiroshi, a shoreline lookout who had spent 10 winters tracking the night movements of the coastal freight skiffs. Despite his long record of guiding travelers safely past the hidden mudbanks, Hiroshi carried a relentless, vibrating twitching along the inside of both palms, an internal knot of a severe, localized anxiety that he was entirely helpless to protect his younger brother, who had left the province to work the deep-sea trawlers. Every time a coastal squall rolled in from the outer bay, Hiroshi's fingers would curl into an agonizing, rigid claw, paralyzed by the conviction that his vigilance from the watchpost was the only invisible tether keeping his brother's distant hull from foundering on the reef. This persistent dread had reached a state of sharp emotional crisis during the recent equinox floods. As a sudden gale tore the main signal sail from its masthead, the canvas ripped violently across its center seam, leaving the upper watch lantern completely exposed to the driving rain. Although the distant fishing fleet had already dropped anchor inside the deep-water harbor 3 leagues away, Hiroshi's intellect transformed the torn sailcloth into an absolute verdict on his inability to shield his brother from danger. He spent his nights in the isolated watchpost, frantically pulling at the rough canvas patches under the dim light of a tallow wick, his palms raw and burning, from trying to force a thick hemp halyard through the wet wood of the rigging block. He operated under the stubborn, exhausting assumption that every terrifying thought crossing his awareness was a literal truth, believing that if his hands let go of the wet canvas for even a single hour, his brother would perish in the open sea. The keeper of the shoreline beacons was Sister Kaya, an old nun whose palms were deeply stained with the black charcoal of the fire pits, and whose slow, heavy stride held the unshifting weight of the coastal dunes. Kaya did not offer abstract psychological definitions or engage in formal debates with the lookouts, choosing instead to spend her twilight splitting pine knots or oiling the heavy canvas signal sails with a flat hornbeam scraper. She had been quietly tracking the progressive freezing of Hiroshi's movements, noting how the webbing between his thumbs remained white and bloodless, even when he was sitting by the hearth, and how he repeatedly checked the tension of the halyard, as if he could pull the distant boats to land through sheer muscular restriction. On an evening, when the heavy sea fog began to leak through the slatted pine vents of the watchpost, wrapping the dark peat flats in a wet, silent insulation, Kaya called the anxious lookout to her sewing bench. Between them lay a large sheet of oil-treated canvas signal sail, its surface stiff and blackened from winters of salt spray. In her hand, Kaya held an unpolished bronze sail needle with a split eye, an ordinary, well-worn tool whose metal shaft had become slightly bent from decades of piercing heavy canvas, causing it to wobble faintly within her fingers whenever she drove it through the tough hemp trim. Hiroshi stood near the bench, the small muscles of his palms pulsing with an intense, familiar panic, his mind instantly leaping to the conclusion that the bent needle was a dangerous flaw, an unacceptable failure of equipment that would cause the stitch to wander and ruin the entire sail before the morning tide. Before he could offer a rapid, intricate explanation on how to straighten the bronze or replace the bone thread to ensure absolute precision, the old woman raised the wobbly needle and pushed it through the stiff canvas with a slow, rhythmic thrust. The bent bronze rattled faintly against the heavy fabric, yet the impact left a perfectly straight, unbreakable lock stitch along the seam of the sail. Hiroshi watched the hemp bind the cloth, his breath catching deep in his throat with a sudden visceral wave of emotional recognition. He reached out his hand, his thumb touching the rough, cold metal of the bent needle, realizing that the tool did not need to be a perfectly straight monolith to complete its protective purpose on the coast. The slight warp in the bronze was not a fatal defect. It was simply a temporary condition of the metal, entirely incapable of breaking the heavy collective momentum of Kaya's arm or the massive granite floor supporting her stance. In that quiet moment, Hiroshi experienced a subtle, grounding transformation, not an instant entry into a state of absolute, unshakable calm, but a small, vital shift in how he related to his own internal suffering. He stopped the frantic habit of treating his anxious thoughts as absolute reality. He looked down at his own raw palms, then at the bent sail needle, and realized that his agonizing feelings of helplessness were nothing more than that faint wobble in the bronze, a passing vibration in a dynamic, imperfect tool, completely separate from the deep, vast ocean that was actively sustaining his brother's life and his own life simultaneously. For the first time in many winters, he stopped resisting the reality of the geographic chasm between the shores. He accepted that he could not control the unpredictable currents of the outer bay or the structural integrity of a distant trawler, but he could choose to stop using his own intellect to hammer a second wound into his palms. With a soft, deliberate release of tension in his wrists, Hiroshi took a long, slow breath before his mind could construct another strategy of defense. And instead of trying to patch the entire sail or flee the watchpost in shame, he chose one small act of compassionate discipline. He walked out onto the slick, mist-covered observation deck, where a young apprentice was struggling to secure a heavy guide rope against the rising tide. Though his own palms still hummed with a residual nervousness and his thumbs were stiff from the alpine draft, Hiroshi did not allow the thought of his insufficiency to paralyze his frame. He knelt on the damp cedar planks beside the boy, wrapped his fingers around the rough hemp cord, and added his weight to the collective effort, letting his palms rest flat against the timber, without needing to verify the safety of the entire coast tonight. This was the quiet realization that brought a different relationship with his difficulty, the understanding that the heart remains whole and connected even when the body holds a pocket of deep geographical uncertainty, resting securely within an interconnected world that requires no flawless performance to remain complete. He returned to the watchpost as the midnight darkness sealed the bay, letting the bent bronze needle rest quietly on the bench of dry peat moss. He did not become a magically perfect lookout whose self-doubt never returned. But as he prepared to lay his frame down upon the thick hemp mat, he stopped treating the rattling of his thoughts as an absolute command to panic. The water continued its slow, rhythmic lap beneath the ferry pavilion. The distant trawlers remained out in the deep current, and the future was entirely unwritten. But the small muscles of his palms finally dropped their defensive leverage, allowing his awareness to slide downward into the massive, undisturbed reality of the ground beneath his bed. When we turn our awareness downward into the rapid, vibrating twitching, currently anchoring itself inside the small muscles of both your palms and within the thin webbing between your thumbs, we begin to decode the hidden structural mechanism that converts ordinary geographic helplessness into a permanent state of internal exile. We frequently live under the stubborn illusion that this constant fear of distant disaster, this deep, visceral dread of being unable to protect someone we love across a geographical gulf, is an external verdict imposed by a critical environment or a highly demanding life path. But if you observe the tight, unyielding brace holding your wrists and lower arms still tonight, you will see that this defensive platform is an active, ongoing construction of your own intellect. It is the somatic consequence of using absolute containment as a shield against the fluid, changing movements of reality. We treat our minds as a constant rigging bench, frantically checking the halyard and pulling at the wet canvas under the tragic delusion that if we can maintain an unyielding boundary of vigilance, we will finally be safe from the risk of being found wanting as a protector. This habitual reliance on hypervigilant calculation is a deeply rooted form of resistance against the natural uncertainty of existence. When an unexpected geographical shift occurs, perhaps an ambiguous message from a distant town, a sudden change in a loved one's trajectory, or the quiet dread of navigating an emergency without a precise blueprint, the mind experiences a profound sense of threat. Instead of allowing the raw, cold texture of that vulnerability to pass through the lower limbs, the intellect immediately steps forward to take command, working at an immense, frantic velocity to categorize and calculate the space. We rehearse the future, we replay the past, and we construct endless defensive arguments in our thoughts, operating under the assumption that keeping our life perfectly measured is the only true way to prevent a sudden fall. But this constant scanning acts exactly like the bent bronze needle driven repeatedly against the stiff canvas. It internalizes the rattle, turning a natural piece of metal into an unstable vibration that warps under the simple weight of the air, leaving the palms locked in a rigid claw, while the living clarity of your original nature turns stagnant beneath the surface. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological structures the mind builds on top of it. Simple Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma by making a direct, compassionate distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral impact of being a sensitive creature in a world constructed out of changing forms, temporary alignments, and natural human boundaries. It is the sudden arrival of an unexpected fissure in a distant foundation block. It is the raw sensation of realizing you must love someone across 3 leagues of dark water. It is the simple, unavoidable sorrow that occurs when an interpersonal path runs out of immediate physical contact. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily work. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain, for the freezing sea fog on the low peat flats does not ask the permission of the lookout before it passes through the slatted pine vents of the watchpost. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our palms and wrist joints, where we translate a temporary pocket of long-distance anxiety into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling helpless or uncertain. The mind turns inward and whispers, "Because your fingers are trembling and your connection has slipped, you are a fundamental failure who has abandoned their post." We do not just navigate an intense period of transition across distance, our thoughts declare. This unmapped separation is proof that your care is inherently broken and incapable of finding a balance. This is the mechanism of turning a temporary pocket of stagnation into a solid identity. The unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural piece of bent bronze for an eternal monument that must be forced into shape through even harder mental scrutiny tomorrow. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its late night hours trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-criticism as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal investigator we carry in our skin. We believe that keeping the inner dialogue sharp, analytical, and critical is a form of protection, that if we keep the file moving against the wood, we will somehow force ourselves to remain safely unassailable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for conceptual approval, trying to decipher the hidden motives of friends and colleagues to prevent the sudden sting of conflict. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental categories is like trying to preserve a balance scale by cutting the notches deeper into the beam. The markings remain trapped in a blurry line, waiting to restrict your natural breathing the moment the amber light fades. True inner transformation does not manifest because you have finally forced every single relationship of your life to become perfectly predictable through an act of sheer will. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand by the cedar counter without immediately picking up the wobbly tool to strike your own foundation. When you allow the reality of the unmeasured hour to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the dry peat moss in the dark, letting the plain canvas remain unstitched in your lap, and letting the inner room be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the lack of perfect clarity running through your foundation. As you let the bed support the heavy framework of your spine right now, notice how the desperate urge to possess a perfect explanation begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire long-distance worry or personal history before the night ends, and you do not need to guarantee that your path will be fully balanced by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect machine that never experiences the sting of doubt or isolation. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the heavy vibration along your palms, naming it as the old defensive pretense, and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, silent chasm that holds both the raw timber and the quiet grease lamp. You are not the loose rudder pin that is currently resting in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But, for now, let your attention drop back down into the quiet, unmoving center of your upper frame. Let your finger joints and your wrist muscles expand outward on their own natural rhythm, taking up all the space they require in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of conceptual performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unmapped, smooth, and supportive as the unnotched wood before the first line of calculation was ever forced into its surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent shoreline watchpost and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The slipped rudder pin and the wobbly bronze sail needle we have been exploring are not abstract historical relics designed to live only within an old maritime archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your fingers and your deep wrist joints when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message or a medical update that might validate your choices, or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not permanently failed the people you love. We live so much of our modern lives inside this structural hypervigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external confirmation of safety, replaying an old interpersonal mistake or an ambiguous conversation, as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow alter a reality that sits 3 leagues away across a geographical chasm. We perform the role of the unshakable guide during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense heavy thickness inside our chest, trying to control the uncontrollable trajectory of a struggling child, a distant parent, or a fragile relationship, entirely parched of rest because we carry the constant secret worry that we are simply not enough to preserve their well-being. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an allure-nothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of your daily life. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to check your phone for reassurance, or when you feel completely behind your peers because you are consumed by a crisis that others cannot see, you are fully permitted to pause, a single slow breath taken before you offer a defensive answer or glance at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every frantic thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a late-night internal courtroom. You can care deeply about the people in your life without gripping the heavy steering oar so tightly that you tear the skin of your own spirit. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the dusty residue of your daily interactions pass over your mind without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true stone frame. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless execution, and that wanting to let your eyes close while someone else is still suffering is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop carrying the weight of the logs or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the seasoned cedar does not feel a shred of remorse for holding only an unladen chassis, and the raw granite stones do not bicker with the ridge for letting their basin remain empty under the fog. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to push an overweighted cart through sheer force of will. It is entirely possible to navigate your modern daily realities, the unuttered arguments, the missed markers, and the uneven paths without allowing the lack of external validation to crush your own pelvic bowl. When we attempt to control the past or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame, we are acting like Hiroshi before his fingers were uncurled, refusing to let the reality of the warping joist exist as a natural configuration of a vast, shifting world. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the universe with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of raw timber, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute perfection. The next time the creeping burning of exhaustion settles deep into your lower spine, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The goal you missed, or the checklist you could not deliver, is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy, and you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the counter without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your wrists relax. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved demands can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhandled rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide, and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, unmoving fog that holds the wetland marshes in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every tireless steering line you tried to maintain within the small muscles of your palms, and every anxious reach across the geographic chasm has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the distant village markets are no longer pulling at your wrist joints. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the dark lake mud, leaving your internal architecture completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your forearms and the sensitive webbing between your thumbs are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the unpinned timber of your true nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, load-bearing foundation of the shoreline rocks. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your chest cage. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the night wind, passing directly through the slatted pine vents of the watchpost. With every long, unheard release of breath, the distinct, vibrating twitching that you held across your hands is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your uncompleted long-distance calculations are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal investigator. The unpolished bronze sail needles have been laid down on the sewing bench. The wobbly iron rudder pins are resting in the canvas pockets, and the critical analytical voices have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight, The loose brackets, the distant storms, and the defensive plans for tomorrow do not require your active parsing while the lakeside flat is cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window pane, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire personal history or bridge the wide geography before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unmeasured, and completely finished with the labor, resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no conceptual performance before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the massive, unmoving basin is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your palms with an all-enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to maintain an absolute grip, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be shattered, because it belongs to the raw, uncarved landscape of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless tracking and vicarious worry. Your upper frame is loose, your wrists are heavy like a dark slab of slate resting in the reeds, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the person you love is already being held by the exact same dark water that is currently supporting the weight of your own resting boat? The dry lake moss absorbs the residual friction of your day, welcoming the tired framework of your hands into its soft, cushioned expanse without demanding that your fingers remain curled or that your mind justify its heavy concern through more analytical labor. In this unmonitored space, your palms are no longer required to act as an emergency winch trying to pull a distant boat to safety through the sheer force of your late-night worry. All the lingering, frantic impulses to check for reassurance, to fix an unmapped crisis from afar, or to replay your geographical helplessness are losing their sharp momentum, sinking slowly down through the bedding, down through the floorboards, and into the cool, silent clay beneath the deep wetlands. The intellect creates the second wound entirely out of its own resistance, turning a natural, passing pocket of empathy into a definitive proof of your own failure, whispering that because you cannot physically reach across the leagues of dark water, your devotion is hollow and your spirit is broken. But the marsh reeds do not apologize to the current for bending in the twilight, and the weathered cedar posts of the pavilion do not feel remorse for remaining locked in the mud. You are completely safe enough to let the distance exist on the map without needing to freeze your wrists in an impossible grip or interpret the silence of the night as an active emergency. Peace does not manifest because you have finally constructed a flawless perimeter of protection that blocks out every unpredictable wave, every sudden downturn, or every painful separation of a human life. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that your true nature is not a fragile target trapped inside your skin. It is the wide open basin of the lake itself, completely unconditioned and unblemished by the small rattling of the loose iron rudder pin. When you stop the exhausting habit of treating every anxious thought as an absolute command, you are choosing to stand by the stone counter with a loose, receptive hand, letting the geography exist in the past while you remain anchored in the unmeasured present hour. The bent bronze sail needle still holds its inherent, unchanging capacity to bind the cloth whether the metal wobbles or stays perfectly straight, and your core remains completely whole, independent of the temporary tremors that pass through your muscles. You do not have to achieve an artificial state of absolute certainty before your forearms are allowed to open, and you do not need to settle the record of your entire long-distance concern before the morning tide arrives. Let your attention slide even deeper into the heavy, supportive mass of your shoulders and your lower arms, allowing the bedding to carry your physical frame without any active coordination from your nervous system. The northern village is managing its own complex crossings, without your supervision. The shoreline watchposts are resting in the mist, and the unresolved demands of the waking world have turned into pale, translucent shadows that carry no authority in this dark sanctuary. You can care deeply about the people you love without gripping the heavy steering oar so tightly that you tear the skin of your own spirit. You can rest. without needing to earn your peace through a continuous display of absolute competence. Your exhaustion is not a moral failure that must be corrected through harder mental scrutiny. Tomorrow it is simply the natural voice of a sensitive form that has run out of vital fuel from trying to hold the entire current in its hands. The movement of your breath has become so slow, so quiet and so thin, that it matches the absolute stillness of the idle timber boats pulled completely out of the water after the final crossing is done. There is no longer any boundary separating the wide, calm expanse of the night from the peace that is expanding within the small muscles of your palms, and along the thin webbing between your thumbs. The old alarms, the missed markers, and the frantic Latinite loops are dissolving entirely into the dark, leaving your spirit as unmapped, smooth, and supportive as the unnotched wood before the first line of calculation was ever forced into its surface. You are returning to the native, untroubled home that has never left you the silent repository, where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic expansion of your body, allowing every muscle, every nerve, and every lingering echo to go completely silent as your weary soul slides effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.